First of all, thank you so much, all of you, for bringing us this incredibly powerful, important film. I don't want to say, you don't want to use words like great and terrific, even though it is great and terrific, because it just, that's not what the subject matter, you know, that's not the right adjective, but it is. And I mean, I could probably sit here with you for 3 hours asking questions, and we just started doing it behind, in the green room. But I actually want to start where the film ended, which is the discovery of the manuscripts, of the archive. And the fact that, like so many stories of survival, it's almost a near miss, where things happen the right way and they could have gone so wrong. And in this case, the fact that only three people knew where these were. Right. The city, what was the ghetto, was in complete rubble. So it took so much effort to find it, and it almost wasn't found because it was just chance and luck and grit, obviously, that one of the three survived. Any of you can take this. Hirsch was the one who survived. Talk about how he survived and how he got people to the place to dig up the archive.
Well, Hirschwasser survived once by jumping from a train that was taking him to Treblinka, and then he returned to the Warsaw Ghetto. And then in 1944, during the big Polish uprising, which completed the destruction of Warsaw, in which 200,000 Poles were killed, Hirschwasser was hiding in a bunker with 5 other people, and the Germans threw grenades into the bunker. And again, miraculously, he and his wife survived. So I guess it was meant to be.
It was shared, as we say, right?
Or geschrieben.
Is that the Yiddish way to say it? Okay. And
that's the only Yiddish word I know.
Okay, good. Well, you probably know a lot more that all of us, people in New York know. So let's actually, because you mentioned that, we were also talking about the Yiddish in the film, and the Yiddish used in the film. As a filmmaker, why was it so important for the actors to speak Yiddish?
Well, I was just trying to make it as difficult as possible. And the Polish actors were really terrific. They were very, very studious. They worked with coaches, dialogue coaches, before we came to shoot. Sam was on the set the whole time, and he worked with them. And in some cases...
You speak Yiddish?
Yeah.
Okay.
From birth, right. And some of the actors did well, and some of them didn't. We actually had to, we redubbed the Yiddish voices 3 times.
We showed, when we were making the film, we went to Boca Raton to a synagogue there, and there were like 1,200 people. I think the youngest person was about 65, 70. And we showed about 25 minutes of the film, just to sort of get, a little feedback. And we had almost a mini riot because they started screaming at us that the accents were too Polish. So that was the first time we knew that we were going to have to really get that right. Even though there's not a lot of Yiddish speakers, they're very sensitive about people.
And so how did you
they do the right
remedy
thing.
that?
Well, we did ADR with the actors, the Polish actors once. I think one of them improved enough to use. And then we did another round. And then finally we ended up working with Yiddish actors or Yiddish-speaking actors from the Yiddish Fiddler here in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really?
So that, and they put us over the top.
Sam kept giving us grades.
When I got to Łódź, or Lodge in Yiddish, I immediately saw a message to go to Miss Budwig's room immediately. And what did she want? She wanted me to go over her Yiddish lines.
This is the woman who played Rachel Auerbach.
And we went over it over and over again, and she got pretty good. And Piotr Głowacki, he made a valiant effort. The other 2 actors, there were issues, so eventually they were dubbed. But in Montreal, where there were also many Yiddish speakers, there was a lot of pushback, and there was this one lady, Beverly Schaefer, told me that she loudly complained. She said, not only was their Yiddish terrible, but their Polish wasn't so good either. And at that point, I just figured she was being hypercritical.
Yeah.
You can't make everybody happy, but we tried, you know.
But to answer your question, I mean, the thrust of the effort was to make the film as authentic as possible. The overarching goal was to give the film the gravitas of a documentary with great scholars like Sam, and based on his book, and then to have the emotional pull of a dramatic feature. And so Yiddish was just part of it. I mean, Yiddish was very important to the members, some of the members of the Oyneg Shabes. Some of them, they all spoke Yiddish and Polish. They all went back and forth quite easily. Some of them spoke Hebrew and other languages as well. But Ringelblum in particular was a lover of the Yiddish language, Auerbach as well. So I just felt like the right thing to do.
You did it beautifully, and it is, I can't imagine that is an easy task to marry documentary with, with dramatic, with actors. I mean, I think we've seen examples of that where it doesn't work so well. This was seamless. It was really, really beautifully done. I want to get into the substance of it, but just real quick, talk about, Nancy, how you came to this project.
Well, Roberta and I worked on a film Above and Beyond before this one. She was directing it, and while we were filming in Israel and everywhere, she was working on developing who will write our history, and she started telling me the stories. And I grew up with really no knowledge of the Holocaust at all. Grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, where the neighbors used to call us dirty Jews and steal our toys and cause havoc. So so much of this is new to me. I don't really know a lot about the Holocaust, so I was pretty amazed to hear the stories. And of course, when they talk about secret buried archives, that is intriguing right there, though this isn't, a wonderful adventure story. But really it was working with Roberta, it was understanding how important it is to personalize the Holocaust, because this is a story that instead of, we're sort of desensitized to the 6 million number, and so we don't feel anything the same way, but here you're hearing their voices and you're sort of connecting to them. You can relate to the mother that says, I had a child that I thought would be the greatest and the best. So I thought that was really critical. It's the only way that we can, get to people is to feel some empathy.
As growing up, learning about the Holocaust, and my grandparents escaped Nazi Europe, although they were never in extermination camps. What I always learned was that the Nazis were the best keepers of history, that they were the best record keepers, and that's how we know everything. But this opens up a completely different perspective. Yes, we have, as you say in the film, we have propaganda, or they say in the film actually, propaganda from the Nazis. They have so much archival footage, but to have it from the perspective contemporaneously of these Jews is remarkable. And you were saying that it's quite different to hear the way that they describe it real time is even different from the survivors who were interviewed right after the events. Talk about that.
Yeah, real-time writing, and not just in the Warsaw Ghetto, but in Vilna, Białystok, everywhere in Nazi-occupied Europe, Jews were writing, but they're writing from within the event. They're still part of a community that's not yet destroyed. They don't know what's going to happen to them tomorrow. And their agendas keep evolving as they learn more. The Oyneg Shabes was very different in 1940 from what it was in 1941. And then in 1942, when they found out about the mass murder, the agendas changed once more. So you see what they're concerned with, you see how their concerns changed, you see what they want posterity to know. And this is, you see a lot of anger against other Jews, which you would not see in post-Holocaust writing. After the Holocaust, the survivors, when they did begin to write about what happened to them, they knew what happened. They focused on how they survived. They focused on the camps, on the death marches. What happened in the ghettos shrank to insignificance. The ghettos simply became a tiny holding pen for the death camps. But in fact, the ghettos were real Jewish communities. There were 500,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. They had lives, they had aspirations. They were not born in 1939. They brought their culture, their values, their pre-war life with them into the ghetto. And without the Oyneg Shabes, we would know nothing about those 500,000 people. They would just be this mass of anonymous victims. They wouldn't have names. We wouldn't know about their religious life. We wouldn't know about the underground press. We wouldn't know about how they stayed alive when the official calorie ration was only 400 calories a day. But because of the Oyneg Shabes, we can write about the Warsaw Ghetto, and not just write about how the Germans destroyed these anonymous mass of Jews, and we're not dependent on German documents, and that's a great thing.
How did you decide, aside from, the obvious, the people who made this happen, the leaders, how did you decide what voices you were going to highlight?
Well, the first decision was to tell the story from the point of view of Rachel Auerbach, and that was the
what made you decide to do that?
Well, it was pretty obvious because she was a part of Ringelblum's milieu before the war. She was in the ghetto, obviously. She was part of the Oyneg Shabes during the war, and then she survived to tell the tale, only one of 3 people. And as Sam writes about at the very beginning of his book, it was really, Wasser knew where the cache was, or the first cache was. He knew where all 3 were, but she was the one who said, when it was 1946, it was a commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Sam writes about it at the very beginning of his book, and she stands up and starts shouting, no more speeches. No more talk. There's a treasure buried beneath the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, and I won't rest until you found it. So and then she spent the rest of her life writing about Ringelblum and the other members of the archive, writing about the Jewish intellectuals, the poets, the artists, the musicians, the writers in particular. And she was a fantastic writer. So she was a natural choice because she could narrate in that way. And once that was decided, then of course you have to have Ringelblum and Lewin. He not only was he a key member of the Oyneg Shabes, but his diary is unbelievably personal. He's the one who writes about his wife being taken away and his daughter crying for the mother, and then it just went from there, and then you have to but you have to put it in context too, right? The historians obviously provide context, but each of the pieces that were chosen to move the story forward. And it was difficult to decide what to leave out.
I found it fascinating that, and especially given the time period that we're talking about, that it was a woman who you decided to tell the story through. As you said, some of it was obvious because she was there at the trial. She read these parts of the archive and so forth. But I was thinking that the whole time I was listening I'm watching and listening to it, like, wow, you would think that it would be mostly or all men.
Right.
But it wasn't.
Perhaps she was a subversive person, and perhaps it was a little subversive on my part.
Yeah. There you go. So speaking of the kind of the quotes and the things that really just make everything hit home, there was one quote from 19-year-old, was it David Graeber? Is that right?
David Garber.
Garber, okay. His last will and testament, he added to the container right before he died, "What we are unable to cry and shriek out to the world, we buried in the ground."
Right.
Wow.
Wow, that's right. He was 19.
19.
Yeah, what 19-year-olds think like that?
But 19 in war years is like 50-something, right?
But,
they have to grow up fast.
But the attitude of doing something for future generations that they wouldn't even be a part of, that's pretty huge. It's having that mindset.
But also they wanted to be remembered, and also that they really understood that the historical significance of what they were doing, and really it was a very sophisticated research institute run by Ringelblum in the depths of hell, right? And Sam can talk about the kind of projects that they were involved in, and the lists that were made, questions for people assigned certain subjects, the questions, the list of questions that they were given to ask. But what's really interesting to me about that statement is that he assumed that when the treasure was dug up, he calls it the treasure, and people understood what had happened there, that it would never happen again. You know, he had a sense that you know, he says to screen the truth to the world, and he felt that, and so did Ringelblum and the others. They hoped that when this truth was known, that this kind of inhumanity could never happen again, and that was part of the reason why, at least towards the end, that they were writing what they did.
There was a woman in the archive, Gustawa Jarecka. She had 2 kids. She wrote in Polish. She was very left-wing. She's a member of the Polish Socialist Party. And she was a stenographer at the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, which meant she had a Judenrat ID pass. And that meant that when the Great Deportation began, she was thought to be safe from being rounded up on the street. So Ringelblum asked her to walk the streets during the roundups when the Jewish police were catching 5, 6, 7 Jews a day to try to save their own skins. And Ringelblum asked her to watch everything and write everything down. And she then began this amazing essay, which she never finished. She and her 2 girls were taken to Treblinka. But in this essay, she said, how could you have blamed us Jews for having thought that the history of mankind is a story of progress, from barbarism to decency? Now that we see the most educated people in Europe, the Germans, murdering kids on the street, we realize it was just the opposite, that the wheel of history has gone from decency to savagery. And then she writes, and I'm quoting her directly, if that's the case, then let my writings be like a stone under history's wheel. That is, that someday somebody will read this and say, oh my God, how could we have allowed this to happen? Let's make sure something like this never happens again. A stone under history's wheel. Wow. And she wrote this shortly before she was deported to Treblinka.
Do we know how many people who participated in the Oyneg Shabes survived?
There were 3 survivors.
Total
Out of 60.
Auerbach, Hirschwasser, and his wife.
And his wife.
That's it.
That's it. The survival rate of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto was about 2%. In fact, of the Jews in Poland who were under German occupation, not those who were in the Soviet Union, but of the Jews in Poland under German occupation, the survival rate was about 2%.
That's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, believable, but just horrible. You mentioned this a little bit, one of you did, but the anger that they felt towards the Jewish police. And that is something that, those who are scholars or, have family members or take the time to learn about it understand that there were Jews who felt that in order to survive and for their family to survive, they had to act like Nazis. And that really comes out. Obviously, even more so in what you've read and what you've read, but you wanted to make sure to put it in the film.
Well, the reason I wanted to make sure to put it in the film is that Ringelblum made sure to include it in the archive. He wanted to make sure that all points of view were incorporated. Whenever he could, if there was an incident, he wanted it to be recorded by a young person, an older person, a religious person, a secular person, feeling that when all those accounts were brought together, then some form of the truth would be there. I mean, he was a real historian, and he was all about objectivity and recording something from as many angles as possible. And so he made sure, he writes in his diary, it's not in the film, he said, he writes something in one of his diary entries that there's been a terrible decline in kinship ties in the ghetto, that the Gestapo burst into an apartment, they go right to a certain painting, they take the painting off the wall, and there are the family's hidden jewels and remaining money, and who but a family member would know that? So he he wanted people to believe it, right? And if it was all very hagiographic, nobody would believe it. So, we show it in the film. There's Jewish prostitutes, there's Jewish police, we don't go into the Judenrat because it would have hijacked the film, because Ringelblum and the other members of the Oyneg Shabes spent a lot of ink.
Explain what that means.
The Jewish council, the Jewish council that was imposed by the Nazis to run the ghetto. And they didn't give them they didn't give them a break, did they, Sam?
No. On August 25th, 1942, a member of the Oyneg Shabes, a Yiddish writer named Shia Perla, who was killed in Auschwitz a year later, saw something that blew his mind. He saw a Jewish policeman dragging a little boy to his SS handler and saying, "This is my 5th head of the day."
Oh.
And the SS man calmly took out his pistol, shot the little boy, and then told the Jewish policeman, "This little dog doesn't count as an adult. Go get me an adult." And the Jewish policeman scampered off to get an adult. And Perla went back to his apartment and wrote a scathing document. He said, what kind of a people can produce such scum as the Jewish police? And then he wrote something which he never, ever would have written had he survived the war. He said, perhaps a people like this deserves everything it's getting.
Oh, wow.
Now, after the war in the DP camps, 6 million martyrs, 6 million Kedoshim, but this showed the anger at the time. Now, this document went through Ringelblum's hands. Ringelblum could have said, oh, this makes us look pretty bad. I'm not going to put this in the archive. But Roberta was right. He wanted to put that in the archive for 2 reasons. One, so that future generations would trust him and trust the archive, because he didn't believe in alternative facts. He believed in facts. But the second reason was, and he wrote this in early 43, he said, I hope that someday when people read these documents, they will learn to look beneath the surface story of demoralization and informing and the Jewish police, and they will dig deeper and see the real story, which he called in Yiddish, das stille Heldentum von dem jüdischen Massenmensch, the quiet heroism of the ordinary Jew. The hundreds of thousands of ordinary Jews who had no money, who didn't know Polish, who didn't have any contacts, who had no hope of survival, who struggled to help their neighbors, to keep their families together, who went to their deaths. And Ringelblum believed that by telling the story of the corruption and the demoralization, he'll have the bona fides to nudge people to dig deeper and find out the real story.
It's just amazing to have to think about somebody who has the presence of mind in such conditions. I mean, obviously he was a historian by training, so this was in his kishkas, but it's remarkable to think about it, and that he convinced other people to do it. Even when, as one of the, one was talking about the hunger and the stomach talking to him. I mean, these are to be able to write about that, feeling the way you did. I mean,
well, as David Roski says in the film, one of the scholars in the film, he said that writing was a way to, maintain your own identity, to
do something,
have connection to yourself, to have connection with your past, to have connection with culture, to who you are. And it wasn't just an act of recording; it was an act of resistance as well. And it also, I think that this mission of the Oyneg Shabes, gave meaning to the lives of the people who were involved in it in a time when it would be pretty easy to completely despair and perceive no meaning. They had a sense of mission.
You, I believe, said that this is like 30,000 Anne Franks.
Yeah.
And it's so true. I mean, one of the reasons why Anne Frank's diary touched so many people, Jews, non-Jews, around the world was, first of all, because she was a young girl, but because it was contemporaneous, and because you got the sense of really what it was like. And this is just...
So that much more power. I mean,
Yeah.
because when you think of how many people that touched, and then you've got this kind of, a mass of documents, of diaries, you hope that the ripple effect will be even further, that more people will learn about it, that it will, shake things up a little bit, maybe make things a little bit better. And, and really, what did they want? You said it, what did these people of the Oyneg Shabes want? They wanted to be remembered. So, we say often to audiences that literally by watching the film, you have, and listening to the words, which were the written words, you have fulfilled their dying wish. So it's almost a proactive, thing you do just from sitting in the chair and watching the film.
They wanted to be remembered, but they also wanted the story to be told from the Jewish point of view.
Right.
And so both of those things are accomplished by you watching the film.
Also, it's easy, and this is the point that you're making about it's so different when you talk to survivors as opposed to reading what they're saying when they are trying to survive. They didn't know if the good guys were going to win or not.
Right.
Like, they didn't know. I mean, the Nazis could have won. I mean, they could, it could be that kind of universe for all they knew at the time. I mean, they certainly felt pretty powerful to the Jews there.
Most Polish Jews were killed in 1942 at a time when the Germans were winning the war. So people like Abraham Lewin, people like Yitzhak Katznelson, a poet who died in Auschwitz in 1944, their writings often were full of despair because they saw Polish Jewry as kind of the cultural nerve center of the Jewish people. And they saw the destruction of Polish Jewry at a time when the Germans were winning the war, and they didn't have the comfort or the consolation of knowing that at least after the war there would be a state of Israel. All they saw was bleakness, despair, and many of the writings written during the war, people are worried they're going to be the last Jew in Europe. And so there was this terrible sense of bleakness and depression. Now, there was also a faith that somehow, some way, the Germans are going to lose. Because if you were convinced the Germans were going to win, then why bother to write? Why bother to have an archive? But when they saw the last days of their lives, they had no consolation. The only consolation they had was the archive, that someday those time capsules will surface. And maybe they'll remember us, they'll remember our names, they'll remember our hopes, our dreams, the names of our kids. They'll remember that we were real people.
It's so incredibly powerful. What about the Uprising? Because the archives are so voluminous. What made it so important to you to dwell on that so much?
Well, the Uprising is a story in itself, and actually was a terrible inconvenience for the structure of the film.
How so?
Because, once Ringelblum and Auerbach leave the ghetto, the story is kind of over, and it kept on feeling like from a purely structural point of view, that the Uprising was a problem. You cannot make a film about the Warsaw Ghetto and not have the Uprising. And you say that we dwelt on it so much, I felt we gave it very short shrift.
Really?
Yeah, and but that's another film, I guess.
Well, and there have been.
Yes, and there have been.
Yeah,
and there have been.
That wasn't
there
your,
have
that
been
wasn't
films
your
about
goal.
and books and everything about the Uprising, because that kind of resistance has been the kind of resistance we've learned about all these years. With this kind of spiritual resistance that this film is about hasn't really been given its due. So I did feel that in a way that it had been told before.
So you talk about. Or maybe at the end it was just in Chiron, but there's a third treasure that is believed to be under the Chinese embassy.
Right, I'm going to let Sam answer this, but I will say that third cache that has the writing about that leading up to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So how the psychology of the ghetto changed, how people supported the fighters, about the bunkers that they built, about what those people were feeling in those times. That's in the third cache. if I'm not incorrect.
And they were buried in different places around the ghetto.
Well, yeah, the first two caches were buried under the school, Novolipki 68. But the third by the time the third cache was buried, according to Hirschwasser, it was buried a week before the outbreak of the uprising. The ghetto had changed. Now there was no big ghetto, there were enclaves. And so it was buried in the Brushmakers enclave on Świętojerska 34, which was the scene of heavy fighting during the ghetto uprising. A detachment led by a Bundist, Marek Edelman, fought for many days. And then what I think happened was that after the war, of course, many Poles went to dig in the ghetto because it was like the Klondike. It was like the California gold rush. And people were hoping to find hidden money and hidden jewels. And I think somebody probably found that third cache and junked it.
Really?
But that's what I
gone?
think. But some years ago, some Israeli searchers got permission from the Chinese to go dig underneath their embassy. And they dug and dug, but they couldn't find anything. Now there's another archaeologist, Richard Freund, who has super duper high-tech equipment, and he's dreaming of going to find that third cache, but lots of luck. China's changed a little bit. When they found the second cache in December 1950, the milk cans, the construction workers, they saw these milk cans, they must be full of buried treasure. When they saw they were papers and documents, they were going to junk it. But the foreman, a guy named Wojcik, said, no, we can't junk it. We have to take this to the Jewish Historical Institute. So that's how the second cache survived.
But you missed a piece of that. That wasn't he a Polish non-Jew who had a Jewish girlfriend in the ghetto? And he was involved in smuggling stuff in and out. That's how he knew what it was.
Yeah.
So that's what Errol Morris, I did a screening of the film with him, and he called it the fragility of history.
This archive survived by such a string of miracles, which is why we're here tonight.
Yeah.
Really, if he had been out to lunch,
Yeah,
the
literally.
workers
Literally.
the workers could have destroyed it.
And what was in, was it separated? And you said the third is mostly about the uprising.
The third, look, the Warsaw Uprising is amazing because this was the only major uprising of any ghetto where the fighters had the support of the Jewish population. In Vilna and in Białystok, especially in Vilna, the fighters were better armed. But you had a Judenrat, you had a Jewish council led by Jacob Gens, who gave the Jews hope that the Wehrmacht likes our uniforms that we're making. They like the boots. We have orders for 6 more months. And some little kid says, let's all commit suicide and die for the honor of the Jewish people. They were told to go to hell. The fighters in the Vilna ghetto were called the Pishers mit the Bixen, the Pishers with the guns. After the war, everybody sang the partisan song. Everybody was all for resistance. But during the war, if you were in a ghetto where the Judenrat offered a modicum of hope, you were not with the fighters. What made the Warsaw Ghetto different was that you had 60,000 Jews in the ghetto, and various events took place, which we don't have time to get into, which meant that the fighting organization and the revisionists got the support of the Jews, who built 750 bunkers. Without those 750 underground bunkers, the fighting would have lasted 2 days. But because of the bunkers, it lasted 4 weeks. And as Javi Dreyfus points out in her recent book in Hebrew, that's what made the Warsaw Ghetto uprising a real uprising. The civilians supported the fighters. And that third cache would have given us all kinds of insights into the dynamics of that psychological transformation.
So you are a historian. You wrote the book.
Kind of, yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
Did you, Roberta, also, did you go through physically all of the papers that you were able to?
No, I mean, I visited the archive, but I don't speak Polish or Yiddish or German. I mean, Sam's book was, my primary document. Though I will say that once I made the decision to use Rachel Auerbach as the narrator, I went to Yad Vashem with a scholar friend there, and we asked for Rachel Auerbach's her personal belongings. Her archive was there, and they brought out these basically shoe boxes. Open them up, it's a complete mess. Everything's just jumbled in there. It's never been digitized, never been cataloged, never been digitized, never been anything. So Sam's now working on translation of Rachel Auerbach's some of her books. But in order to make the film, I had a woman in Los Angeles for 2 years translating her writing.
Wow.
So
get that box organized?
No.
No. That's, I think, part of what's great about this film is even that effort to take something that nobody really has access to. The general population does not have access to it. They can read Sam's book, but then to even go further is what you did by translating the works is another step to make this accessible, because a lot of this is digitized now, and some is translated into English, and I imagine more will be as time goes on, as money is available, that maybe more will be accessible to the population.
Did she have children?
No. No, she died in 1976 of breast cancer. She ran, and she was really alone. I mean, I don't think she was like a really fun gal to be around. She was destroyed, a destroyed person. But she ran the survivor testimony department at Yad Vashem. She had terrible difficulties with, kept on being fired and coming back. There was a tension between the German-trained professional historians and the survivor historians. But more than that, what did they call Hillary? A difficult woman? No, it was something else.
She was regarded as a pushy, difficult woman.
She was a nasty woman.
Yeah.
And
I mean, who can blame her?
No, but she did amazing
She
things.
earned that.
No, she did, but she did amazing things. Not only during her lifetime did she either take or supervise the recording of 50,000 testimonies at Yad Vashem, survivor testimonies, but it was she who convinced Gideon Hausner, the Israeli state prosecutor of the Eichmann trial, to base the Eichmann trial on survivor testimony, and she was able to sit with him and say, this one's good on this one's good on this one never shuts up, this one's a pain in the ass, this one's excellent on this, and to help him shape the story. And it wasn't the story of Eichmann, it was the story of the Holocaust, and there were 5 cameras running the entire time, so this was really the first time the world heard the survivors speak in 1961, Sam, or 63?
60, well, they caught him in 60 and the trial was in 61.
Okay, 61. So, of course, I thought I would start the film with Rachel Auerbach's film testimony, but guess what? That was the only time the cameras weren't running.
Stop.
No, I'm not kidding.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not kidding. But
it doesn't exist?
No, it doesn't exist. But there was a stenographer, so what she said was recorded.
Who turned a camera off during that trial?
She just wasn't considered important.
She was cut off after half an hour. She was told she would have at least an hour, and she was promised at least an hour. The judge cut her off after half an hour.
But not only that, but during that little bit of time she had, they kept on interrupting her. She wanted to talk about Ringelblum. She wanted to talk about Warsaw. She wanted to talk about the rich cultural flowering of Jewish Warsaw, and even in the ghetto, and she wanted to talk about the Oyneg Shabes, but they didn't give her a chance. And she didn't really recover from that.
That's totally understandable. I think we might have time for a few audience questions. Does somebody, I heard there were cards. Are there cards? Do I have them? Behind me?
And
Here they are.
It's like
From behind the
magic.
curtain.
like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is an important question. Where will it be shown besides here?
Okay, I can answer that one.
Okay.
Well, first of all, we have been showing, we're doing some screenings. We are also now in our for-your consideration campaign, meaning that we're hoping to be shortlisted for an Oscar. So, we're doing a few screenings here. We also just signed a deal with Discovery Network, so we will be broadcast globally, and that will most likely be at the beginning of the year. But the film is on Google and iTunes and Hulu and things like that, streaming. We are pushing for, we cut an educational version, a 37-minute version, which also is some of the harder things, you know, the more difficult things to watch are taken out for younger kids. And we've created a study guide as well there. And we are pushing it, so doing a big educational push besides the streaming and besides the broadcast. And when people, if they want screenings, they contact us. And we try to set up screenings at their,
The film was also released theatrically. It played in New York and LA, played in, I think, over 100 other cities. And we also, on last International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we had a global screening event we had 355 screenings in 55 countries and 15 languages. Our anchor screening was at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. It was hardship duty, but the three of us went there to Paris.
How did you do that? That sounds terrible.
And that was, that we had Facebook Live component, and that was a pretty big deal. So the film has been seen. And will continue to be seen because sadly the story is evergreen and the end of the story doesn't change. So the film will continue to be seen.
And the interesting thing is when we did the global screenings, there were over 50 screenings in Poland alone.
Right.
And there's a huge push in Poland. We work with an organization called Forum for Dialogue that's also taking high school kids, teaching them what Jews are and what happened in Poland, and then showing the film to them as well.
So there's a push and there's obviously a desire.
There is a desire.
Well, you know, Poland's just like every place else. There's red states and blue states, and people who want to deny the Holocaust and people who want to learn about it. It's, you know, certainly our entire film crew was very, very committed to learning about the story and helping to tell the story.
Okay, also on this card, how long did it take to make?
7 years.
7 years?
Yes.
From when to when?
Like 7 years from when I read a review of Sam's book that called the book a work of historical rescue, which it is. Well, I did do, I co-directed the film Seeing All Red, Somewhere in the Middle.
And Above and Beyond?
No.
Above and Beyond was 2011.
Oh,
and
yes,
that's
and
when
Above
we
and
started
Beyond.
to develop this.
Right.
Right.
I can't remember. If somebody would help me remember my life, I'd be very grateful. But
well, that's
it took
why you
a
have
long
Nancy.
time. And the thing that took the longest time, I mean, yes, of course, raising the money was difficult. It's an expensive film for a documentary. But what really took the longest time was to figure out what to leave out and how to structure the story.
Sure. Oh my gosh.
The filming of the scholars was all over the world. The filming of the dramatizations was in Poland. We did the burying of the archive in a basement of an abandoned factory in LA. But most of it was shot in Poland.
You mentioned taking out the harder stuff for kids. The footage of the bodies and the dragging and the carts, that's all.
Yes, that's
real.
yeah. Everything that's black and white is archival footage. Primarily, well, the footage is all shot by the Nazi propaganda units. Yeah. The photographs, there were hundreds of photographs in the Oyneg Shabes archive. Only 70 odd photographs survived. And you can tell what's from the archive and what's German, because if it's, you know, like children begging on the street and people walking by not paying attention to them, that's German propaganda. If it's smugglers or orphanages or soup kitchens, that's from the archive.
When you say from the archive, you mean photographs?
Yeah, about 70 photographs survived. There were hundreds of photographs, but when they hit the air, they just went white. Yeah. I mean, Rachel Auerbach tells the story, the scene that you see when they open the boxes, she had put her own diaries and writing and her family photographs in one of the boxes. And she says, and I didn't use it in the film because it you know, it was a little too sad, but she said, you know, I took out the photographs and the images disappeared, and I lost my family for the last and final time.
Ugh.
So yeah,
You should have put that in.
You should have put that in.
Did you hear it? They liked that.
Well, they might, but you wanted to have some feeling that they succeeded.
Right.
Some feeling like that their resistance was successful on some level, and so I didn't want to kill that at the end.
Yeah. Okay, so this is bringing it to modern day. What is our responsibility to refugees in war-torn Syria, refugees at the border, especially as Jews, given the history?
Well, you know, well, I'm sorry, I'm jumping in again, and I'll be very brief, and then you guys can answer as well. But my feeling is that, of course, never again for the Jews. But never again doesn't mean never again for the Jews. It means never again for humanity. And once you get to a certain place in the rise of whatever you want to call it, the right, totalitarianism, fascism, dictatorship. When you let it go too far, it can very easily, and when you've done a really good job at making people who are not like you the other, they're bringing in disease, just like you saw in the film, the parallels are quite obvious. Or when propaganda and lies are being used as political tools to gain power. You have to stop it before it gets too far. So that's what the parallels are. And I don't know, I'll let you guys answer.
Well, listen, I think as Jews, and I believe in the laws of the Torah, and I believe in how we have to take care of each other. We have that responsibility to help all people, not just Jews. So it's a tough situation, but I think that if somebody's in need, we need to do what we can to help.
Do you want to answer that?
Well, since I spent the first 3 years of my life as a stateless refugee, we have a responsibility to help. That's easy to say. The real responsibility is to make it politically feasible. The reason why so few Jewish refugees were admitted into the United States was because not just the Republicans were against immigration, but the AFL-CIO was against immigration, and the Southern Democrats were against immigration. And so Roosevelt could have said, well, my career be damned, let in all the immigrants. He would have lost, and he would not have been reelected to a third term. So the real challenge is to make compassion for refugees a politically acceptable choice. And that takes a lot of hard work. And I'm full of admiration for Angela Merkel. What she did was so courageous. And it was also kind of an act of political hara-kiri. Because it's not clear that she got her people behind her. She showed the way, but what she did has to be emulated.
Yeah, well, obviously, she is in a country that, she's in a country and she is of the age where she gets it. I mean, she understands it. My grandfather was Austrian, and he took my family on a, he called it the This Is Your Life tour, and we went in the mid-90s all over where he was from, and then where he escaped, and where they were hiding, and all this. And the whole time, he just kept beating into the head of my mom and my aunt and my brother and me. It's, for so many of us, it wasn't that they wanted to kill us, is it like that there was nowhere else for us to go. We had nowhere to go. No one would let us in, pre-Israel. And so that is just rings in my head with every modern discussion.
It didn't even matter that it was pre-Israel. I mean, the British weren't letting the Jews into Palestine, right? So there really was nowhere to go.
Yeah, well, I mean, pre-State of Israel. Yeah, exactly. Let me see if there's anything else you've answered. Should the archive be moved to Israel?
Well, I guess we'd have to have an Entebbe raid on the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Because I don't think the Polish government is a Polish national treasure, whether they're sometimes, well, Sam, you answer that one.
Well, it could be moved to Israel, but you'd have to arrange for 20 superbly trained burglars to go into the Jewish Historical Institute and take it out of Poland. No, the Polish government will never let the archive out. It's a UNESCO treasure. There is a Jewish Historical Institute. The fact is that ever since the late 80s, when communism began to collapse in Poland, the money finally came from the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum and other sources to finally take care of the archive. The archive is being well taken care of. Poland has made copies available. 36 volumes have just been published. There's a CD-ROM at the end of each volume with copies of the original documents. The Jewish Historical Institute and the Poland Museum are sponsoring conferences and so on. So without getting into the problems of the present Polish government, the fact is the archive right now is in good hands.
Okay, so it's getting late. I want to wrap this up, but before I do, each of you talk about the lessons of this film and of these stories that those of us who, that we can take and apply to today's times, aside from what we were just talking about.
I'll go first. Because I guess I'm pushy and bossy, but the most remarkable thing I learned or discovered was Rachel Auerbach. She's an incredible writer and an incredible person. I learned something about the ethical and moral choices that these people, in the most extreme circumstances, were making day by day and minute by minute. So if they can make really ethical choices in those circumstances, I can try to be the best person that I can be. But the thing that I learned that I have on my desktop is that I just have to say this last thing, that in 1933, when Hitler came to power, there was still a press in Germany. It was crippled by the politics and crippled by the economic situation there, but there was still a press. And when newspapers printed articles that were critical of Hitler and of the Nazis, Hitler called it Lügenpresse, which it translates literally to fake news. So I'll just leave that there.
So I'm going to plagiarize Sam in the film, but I think it's something that also relates to today, that words matter, that words are a form of resistance. As Sam says, you don't need guns to fight. You can fight with pen and paper. And dialogue's important. And I think that if we could all talk to each other, instead of finding other ways to work situations out, that we'd be in a better place. Sorry, I stole your line, Sam.
Well, those would have been my lines, but I'll come up with new lines, which is that to truly respect yourself and to truly respect others, you have to make a real effort to find out about the past. You can't simply live in the present. And by taking the effort to find out about the past, you not only learn more respect for yourself, but you learn more respect for people who are not like you. Ringelblum was a committed Jew. He loved the Jewish people, but at the same time, he was a Marxist. He was very left-wing. By our standards, he would be very PC. And he said over and over again that the archive is not just for the Jewish people, the archive is for all of mankind. He refused to believe that anti-Semitism was baked in the cake of people's DNA. He said that with enough goodwill, it could be overcome. I'm not sure I agree with him, but history is not just, it doesn't just demand effort, but it demands a lot of self-introspection. And at the same time, if it could teach us anything, it teaches us how easy it is to lose what we have. How easy it is, by not caring, to simply let a country go, to let a republic go, to let norms go. And that's what I would take away.
Wow.
Thank you. I learned so much. Thank you, all of you, for making this film, for doing the work, for the blood, sweat, and tears that went into this, because it is a gift for history, and it is a gift for all of us now.
Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
This was great. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for coming tonight.